She went to bed and was never seen again. How does a girl vanish from her own locked bedroom in the middle of the night, without a struggle, without a sound? For decades, the case of Lena Whitmore haunted the sleepy town of Ridgeview, Oregon. But the real horror isn't just in her disappearance. It's in what was overlooked, because the signs were there, silent, subtle, unsettling, and yet no one noticed. In this investigation, we uncover 5 hidden warning signs that were ignored for years and reveal the final discovery that changed everything. You'll see how one of these signs, the most ordinary one, held the key to the truth all along. Morning dew settled over rows of cedar fences as dawn broke over Ridgeview, Oregon, a town of 12,000 souls that prided itself on safety, predictability, and neighbors who knew each other's coffee preferences. A place where most crimes involved teenagers stealing garden gnomes or the occasional drunk driver weaving home from the single bar on Main Street. It was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked. Maggie Whitmore had already been awake for 20 minutes when she walked down the upstairs hallway toward her daughter's bedroom. Her footsteps made the floorboards creak, a familiar symphony in the 1920s colonial that had been her husband's childhood home before his parents passed it down to them. "Lena," she called, knocking lightly. "Honey, it's almost 7. No response. This wasn't unusual for her 14-year-old daughter, who had recently discovered the teenage superpower of sleeping through any noise short of a marching band. Maggie knocked once more, then pushed the door open. The morning light illuminated particles of dust floating in the air, highlighting what wasn't there more than what was. Lena's rumpled covers pulled back on one side, her pillow still bearing the indentation of her head. One fuzzy blue slipper lay overturned near the foot of the bed, its match still positioned neatly by the closet. And the window, the double-hung window that Lena always kept locked because she'd once read a ghost story about things that climb through open windows at night, stood wide open. The screen, which should have been securely fastened, was missing entirely. Maggie's first thought wasn't abduction. It was rebellion. 14 had been difficult. There had been arguments about curfew, about the length of Lena's skirts, about a boy 2 years older who drove a car Maggie didn't approve of. Maybe Lena had snuck out to meet him and would be climbing back through that window any minute, ready with excuses about needing air or watching the stars. But Lena's shoes were still lined up in her closet, all of them. Her phone sat untouched on her nightstand, the charger still plugged in. Her hairbrush remained exactly where she'd left it the night before, strands of long brown hair still tangled in its bristles. The floor beneath the window was pristine, no footprints, no dirt, tracked in from outside. Nothing to suggest someone had climbed in or out. Maggie stepped back into the hallway, her heartbeat accelerating. "Clara? Clara, is Lena with you?" 19-year-old Clara appeared at her bedroom door, sleep-rumpled and confused. "What? No. Why would she be with me?" It took 9 minutes for Maggie to search every room in the house, calling Lena's name with increasing panic. It took another 13 minutes to check the backyard, the front porch, the side yard where Lena sometimes sat on the old swing when she wanted to think. At 7:13 a.m., Maggie Whitmore called the police. By 9 a.m., the first patrol cars had arrived, followed shortly by detectives who treated the Whitmore house like the crime scene it had suddenly become. Yellow tape appeared across the driveway. Officers in latex gloves carefully inspected Lena's room, taking photographs of the bed, the window, the missing screen that was eventually found lying in the flower bed below, unbroken and meticulously removed. Neighbors began to gather at the perimeter, whispering behind cupped hands. By noon, the first news van had arrived, a local affiliate that had caught wind of the disappearance through police scanner chatter. Channel 6 News, reporting live from Ridgeview, where 14-year-old Lena Whitmore appears to have vanished from her bedroom overnight. The search began in concentric circles around the Whitmore property. Volunteers combed through yards, woods, drainage ditches. Police dogs sniffed articles of Lena's clothing, then led handlers through neighborhood streets before losing the scent near a small ravine behind the Whitmore's garden. Detective Ross Hale stood at that ravine's edge, frowning at what appeared to be recent shovel marks in the soil. The earth had been disturbed, not churned up by animal activity, but cleanly cut, as though someone had dug and then carefully replaced the dirt. "Get forensics down here," he called to a uniformed officer. "I want samples from this area." While the search expanded outward, a different kind of investigation was happening inside the Whitmore home. Detectives interviewed Maggie, Clara, and a parade of neighbors who had come to offer support. They built a timeline that felt more like a question with no answer. "I looked in on her around 10:30, Clara told Detective Hale, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "She was watching something on her laptop. I said goodnight and went to bed." "And you didn't hear anything after that?" Hale pressed. "No unusual noises, no voices?" Clara shook her head. "I got up around midnight for a glass of water. The house was completely quiet. No creaking floors, no doors opening." "And your dog? I understand you have a golden retriever." "Storm? He sleeps downstairs in the kitchen. He barks at everything, the mail carrier, squirrels, even leaves blowing across the yard. But he didn't make a sound last night." This detail registered as significant in Hale's notebook. A dog that normally alerted to any disturbance, silent on the night a girl disappeared from her bedroom? The veterinarian who examined Storm later that day noted mild signs of sedation, though no obvious source was found. Among those who arrived to comfort the Whitmores was Dennis Larkin, their next-door neighbor for the past 8 years. A construction contractor in his mid-40s, Larkin was known throughout Ridgeview as dependable, friendly, and always willing to help. The kind of neighbor who cleared your driveway after a snowstorm without being asked, who remembered your children's birthdays with small, thoughtful gifts. "I just can't believe it," he told Detective Hale as they stood in the Whitmore's kitchen. Dennis was preparing coffee, moving through the space with the familiarity of someone who had been there countless times before. "Lena's such a good kid. Always polite, always says hello. I saw her yesterday afternoon getting the mail. She waved, just like always." Hale watched Larkin's hands as he measured coffee grounds, noting the man's steady movements, his composed demeanor. Most neighbors were visibly shaken, but Larkin seemed oddly centered, almost too helpful. "How well do you know the family, Mr. Larkin?" "Call me Dennis, please." "Well enough, I'd say. Their fence joins mine on the east side. I've helped Maggie with some repairs over the years, since her husband passed. Fixed a leaky faucet last month. Lena used to pet sit Storm when they'd go visit Maggie's mother in Portland." As Larkin spoke, he continued making himself useful, answering the Whitmore's phone when it rang, jotting down messages, directing other neighbors to tasks that needed doing. He inserted himself into every conversation, every search update, every planning session, always near, always ready with information, suggestions, and a calm presence that should have been comforting but to Hale's eye seemed calculated. By 5:25 p.m., gathering storm clouds forced the search teams to suspend operations for the night. One day had passed, and Lena Whitmore had become a statistic, one of the thousands of children who disappear in America each year. The Whitmore family gathered around their dinner table that evening. Lena's chair conspicuously empty, pulled out slightly as though expecting her return at any moment. The food that neighbors had brought, casseroles, pies, sandwiches, sat untouched. "We'll find her," Clara said firmly, reaching for her mother's hand. "The police are doing everything they can." Maggie nodded mechanically, her gaze fixed on the empty chair. She hadn't cried yet, wouldn't cry for days, locked in a state of suspended animation where tears would make this real, and she couldn't allow it to be real. Outside, the rain began to fall, washing away any remaining scent trails, any footprints that might have been overlooked, any evidence exposed to the elements. Nature has no respect for human tragedy. It simply moves forward, indifferent. And in Ridgeview, Oregon, a town that had believed itself immune to true darkness, something shifted fundamentally that night. Doors that had been left unlocked for decades suddenly acquired deadbolts. Children who had played freely in front yards were now watched through windows. Parents who had never worried about their teenagers' whereabouts now demanded hourly check-ins. Trust, the invisible foundation that had held the community together, began to crack. By the fourth day after Lena's disappearance, Detective Ross Hale had begun to notice something that made him uneasy. The investigation was generating leads, most of them useless, but one person seemed to anticipate each development before it happened. Dennis Larkin. The man appeared constantly at the edge of every search area, every press conference, every gathering at the Whitmore home. He volunteered for every search party, but always managed to be assigned to sectors closest to the house. When asked about this pattern, his answer sounded reasonable. The ground closest to home is where you start. That's standard procedure. But there was nothing standard about Larkin's level of involvement. He had taken time off work, indefinite leave, he called it, to focus on finding Lena. He organized volunteers, distributed flyers, and spent hours sitting with Maggie, who seemed to find his presence comforting. "He's been an absolute godsend," Maggie told Hale during a follow-up interview. "I don't know what we'd do without Dennis." Clara, however, didn't share her mother's comfort with their neighbor's constant presence. "He keeps saying he knows how I feel," she confided to Hale when they happened to be alone. "But that's not true. Nobody does." There was something in her voice, doubt, perhaps, or uneasiness, that made Hale press further. "Has Mr. Larkin ever made you uncomfortable? Before all this happened, I mean." Clara hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Not exactly uncomfortable, just, I don't know, he watches. Not in a creepy way, just attentive. He notices things most people don't." "Like what?" "When I changed my hair color last year, he commented on the exact shade, said it was auburn with copper undertones." "Who says that?" And he knew when Lena got her braces off, even though she'd only had them removed that morning, and was trying not to smile because her teeth felt weird. Hale made a note, then asked, "Did he ever pay special attention to Lena?" "No more than to me, I guess. He gave her a silver charm for her bracelet on her 14th birthday. A little house, because he said, 'Home is where your story begins.'" She thought it was sweet. "The bracelet, was she wearing it the night she disappeared?" Clara nodded. "She always wore it. Dad gave it to her before he died. She never took it off, even in the shower." The missing bracelet became another item on the growing list of things that didn't add up. If Lena had left voluntarily, she would have taken her cherished bracelet. If she'd been forcibly abducted, the bracelet might have been torn off, broken, left behind. Its complete absence suggested deliberate removal, almost like a trophy. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of the soil samples from the ravine behind the Whitmore's garden yielded an unexpected result. The disturbed earth contained traces of a cement mixture not commonly used in residential construction, a specialized blend typically employed for industrial foundations. The lab could only confirm that it didn't match the native soil composition of the area. When Hale shared this information with the search coordinator, he was told that Dennis Larkin's construction company, Ridgeview Builders, had recently been awarded a contract to develop several new properties on the outskirts of town. The project was still in the early stages, but ground had been broken at a site known locally as Lot 23. This connection wasn't enough to justify a formal investigation of Larkin, but it added to Hale's growing suspicion that something wasn't right with their helpful neighbor. On the 7th night after Lena's disappearance, a significant breakthrough seemed imminent. Search dogs picked up a scent trail at an abandoned orchard 2 miles from the Whitmore home. The entire town mobilized in renewed hope. Volunteers poured in from neighboring communities, helicopters circled overhead with thermal imaging equipment, and police cordoned off a wide area around the old apple trees. Near midnight, a search volunteer found a pink jacket buried under fallen leaves and debris. For 3 agonizing hours, the Whitmore family waited at home while forensics examined the garment. When Detective Hale finally called with an update, the disappointment was crushing. "It's not Lena's," he confirmed. "The size is wrong, and the manufacturing tag indicates it's at least 5 years old." Hope collapsed like a deflated balloon. During a live news interview the following morning, Maggie Whitmore finally broke down, her composure crumbling on camera as she pleaded for information about her daughter. Dennis Larkin was there, as always, catching her shoulders as she swayed, guiding her away from the reporters' microphones, murmuring reassurances that no one else could hear. The image, a distraught mother being supported by the steady neighbor, was broadcast nationally, appearing on morning shows and news programs across the country. It solidified the narrative that had been forming. A quiet town shattered by inexplicable tragedy, united in grief and determination. What the cameras didn't capture was Detective Hale watching from a distance. His eyes narrowed as Larkin's hand lingered a moment too long on Maggie's back. Nor did they record the conversation that followed when Hale approached Larkin later that day. "You seem to know this case inside and out, Mr. Larkin," Hale observed casually. "Almost like you've got special insight." Dennis's smile never faltered. "Just trying to help, Detective? Isn't that what neighbors do?" "Most neighbors don't take indefinite leave from their jobs. Most don't insert themselves into every aspect of an investigation. Most neighbors aren't as close as I am to the Whitmores." Dennis's voice remained pleasant, but something flickered behind his eyes. A momentary hardness, quickly concealed. "Maggie needs support right now. Clara, too. I'm just doing what anyone would do." "Where were you the night Lena disappeared, Mr. Larkin? Between, say, 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. The question seemed to surprise him, but only briefly. "At home, asleep. I live alone, as you know, so I don't have anyone to confirm that. But I'm sure you've already checked my phone records, power usage, whatever else you look at these days." He was right. They had checked. No calls had been made from Larkin's landline that night. His power usage showed normal fluctuations consistent with refrigerator cycling and other baseline appliances. There was nothing to suggest he hadn't been home in bed, but there was also nothing to confirm it. As the 2-week mark approached, the investigation began to stall. Leads dried up. Media attention drifted to newer tragedies. Even the volunteers began to dwindle, returning to jobs and responsibilities they couldn't postpone indefinitely. The case remained active, but the frenetic energy of those first days had dissipated, replaced by a grim, methodical process, checking sex offender registries, interviewing distant acquaintances, following up on tips that grew increasingly far-fetched and desperate. Through it all, Lena's bedroom remained untouched, a shrine frozen in time. Maggie refused to move anything, insisting that when Lena returned, she would want her room exactly as she'd left it. The open window had been closed and locked, the screen replaced, but everything else remained in suspended animation. Clothes in the closet, school books on the desk, a half-finished art project spread across her workable. When Detective Hale suggested processing the room more thoroughly, removing floorboards, checking air vents, searching for hidden evidence, Maggie refused vehemently. "You've already photographed everything, fingerprinted everything," she insisted. "I won't have you tearing apart the only piece of her I have left." What Hale couldn't explain, what he didn't fully understand himself, was his growing certainty that the answer to Lena's disappearance wasn't in the woods, the ravine, or the abandoned orchard. It was closer, much closer. In his case notes, on a page dated July 3rd, 1996, he wrote, "Subfloor access between properties." The question was circled twice, then underlined, a thought he couldn't shake but couldn't yet prove. By August, the official search had been scaled back to routine patrols and occasional follow-ups on new tips. Lena Whitmore's case file moved from active to open but inactive, a bureaucratic designation that reflected the grim reality. Without new evidence, there was little more they could do. The town of Ridgeview began the long process of healing, of returning to a version of normal that would never feel quite right again. Students went back to school in September. Businesses removed the Find Lena posters from their windows, replacing them with Harvest Festival announcements and back-to-school sales. Life continued, as it always does, flowing around the obstacle of tragedy, like a river around a fallen tree. But some things didn't return to normal. Maggie Whitmore rarely left her house, becoming almost reclusive in her grief. She declined invitations, stopped attending church, and communicated with the outside world primarily through Clara, who had postponed her plans to attend university in order to stay home and care for her mother. And Dennis Larkin remained a constant presence in their lives, checking in daily, bringing groceries, handling repairs, making himself indispensable to a household fractured by loss. His construction business continued to thrive, expanding to include developments beyond Ridgeview's borders. Lot 23, once just a patch of cleared forest on the outskirts of town, began to take shape as the foundation for a small residential complex. Detective Ross Hale watched it all with growing frustration. He knew, he was absolutely certain, that Dennis Larkin was hiding something. But knowing and proving were entirely different matters. "It's the perfect crime," he confided to his partner over coffee, 3 months after Lena's disappearance. No body, no witnesses, no physical evidence, just a missing girl and a whole lot of questions. "You still think the neighbor did it?" his partner asked skeptically. "I know he did." Hale's certainty was absolute. The way he inserts himself, the way he's made himself essential to the mother. And there's something else. Something I can't quite put my finger on. Like what? Like the fact that he never asks questions about the investigation anymore. In the beginning, he wanted details. Where we were searching, what we'd found, which leads we were following. Now, nothing. It's like he already knows there's nothing to find. But without evidence, Hale's suspicions remained just that. Suspicions. And as months turned into years, even those began to seem more like obsession than legitimate investigative instinct. In 1998, Ross Hale was transferred to the Portland Police Bureau, leaving Ridgeview and the Whitmore case behind. Before departing, he made copies of his case notes, including his theories about Dennis Larkin and the cryptic question about subfloor access. These he left with a young officer named Michael Reeves, with a simple instruction: keep an eye on Larkin. Someday he'll make a mistake. What neither of them could have anticipated was how long it would take for that mistake to surface, or how completely it would unravel the carefully constructed fiction that Dennis Larkin had built around himself. As years passed, Lena Whitmore's disappearance became part of Ridgeview's identity, a tragedy that had marked the town, changed its character, altered its self-perception. Annual memorial events kept her memory alive. Candlelight vigils on the anniversary of her disappearance, charity runs in her name to raise awareness about missing children, scholarship funds established to honor what would have been milestones in her life. Through all of these, Dennis Larkin remained prominently involved, organizing, donating, supporting. He never left Ridgeview, never married, never seemed to move beyond the role he had created for himself as the Whitmores' steadfast friend and protector. To most observers, his dedication appeared admirable, a testament to community spirit and neighborly compassion. But there were others who found his continued involvement unsettling, even inappropriate. Clara Whitmore was among them. As she grew into adulthood, her uneasiness about Dennis Larkin's presence in their lives never entirely disappeared. She'd eventually attended university, earned a degree in psychology, and moved to Seattle, far enough to establish independence, but close enough to visit her mother regularly. During those visits, she often found Dennis at the house, fixing something, bringing food, or simply keeping Maggie company. "Don't you think it's a little strange?" she asked her mother during a rare moment when they were alone. "It's been 5 years and he's still here almost every day." Maggie's defense of Dennis was immediate and fierce. "He's been our rock, Clara. When everyone else moved on, when people stopped calling, stopped visiting, Dennis was still there. He remembers her birthday every year. He maintains her memorial garden. How can you question that kind of friendship?" But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unhealthy, something obsessive about Dennis's continued involvement in their lives. Particularly disturbing was his refusal to allow any changes to Lena's bedroom, which remained exactly as it had been the day she disappeared. When Maggie had briefly considered converting it to a sewing room, Dennis had reacted with such vehement opposition that she'd immediately abandoned the idea. "It would be like giving up hope," he'd argued, "like admitting she's never coming back." What Clara couldn't articulate, what she couldn't fully acknowledge even to herself, was the growing suspicion that Dennis didn't want that room changed because there was something hidden there. Something that might be discovered if walls were opened, if floorboards were lifted, if the shrine-like preservation was disturbed. In 2001, when Clara was 24 and working as a counselor for at-risk youth in Seattle, she received a phone call that would set her on a path she'd long avoided. The caller introduced himself as Michael Reeves, now a detective with the Ridgeview Police Department. "I'm reopening your sister's case," he told her without a preamble. "Unofficially, for now, I'd like to meet with you." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop halfway between Seattle and Ridgeview, neutral territory where Clara felt she could speak freely without worrying about who might overhear. Detective Reeves was younger than she'd expected, probably not much older than herself. He carried a worn leather briefcase that he placed carefully on the table between them. "These are Ross Hale's original notes," he explained, removing a thick folder. "He left them with me when he transferred out. I've been reviewing them, and I think he was onto something." Clara's heart raced as Reeves spread photographs across the table, images of Lena's bedroom, the window, the flower bed where the screen had been found. There were also photos she'd never seen before, Dennis Larkin's property, focusing on the area where his yard adjoined the Whitmores. Close-ups of a basement window, a utility access panel, the foundation where the two properties met. "Detective Hale believed that Dennis Larkin was involved in your sister's disappearance," Reeves said quietly. "He had a theory that there might be some kind of access between the properties, through the foundations maybe, or via a tunnel." Clara stared at him, a chill running through her despite the coffee shop's warmth. That's impossible. Our houses are separate structures. There's no connection. Above ground, yes, but your house and Larkin's were both built in the 1920s, during Prohibition. A lot of houses from that era had hidden passages, secret rooms, ways to move alcohol without being seen. Hale found architectural records suggesting that your house and Larkin's might have once been connected by a tunnel that was later sealed off. The implication was staggering. If such a connection existed, it would mean Dennis could have accessed their home, accessed Lena's bedroom, without anyone knowing, without leaving external evidence. "Why are you telling me this now?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I need your help. Your mother won't allow us to examine the house thoroughly. You said so yourself in your statement years ago, but if you could convince her, or if you could look for signs yourself—" Clara shook her head. "She'd never agree. And Dennis is there all the time. If he suspected anything, Reeves leaned forward. That's exactly my point. Why is he there all the time? What's he protecting? Normal people don't maintain this level of involvement for 5 years. They move on. The detective's words echoed Clara's own doubts, giving shape to fears she'd tried to dismiss as paranoia. But the reality, the possibility that Dennis Larkin had murdered her sister and had been hiding in plain sight, comforting her mother, maintaining Lena's shrine, was almost too horrifying to contemplate. There's something else, Reeves continued, sliding a newspaper clipping across the table. Larkin's company is finishing that development at Lot 23. Final inspections are scheduled for next month. What does that have to do with Lena? Probably nothing. But Hale noted that soil samples from your backyard matched concrete mix found at Larkin's construction sites, and Lot 23 broke ground right around the time your sister disappeared. The coincidence seemed thin, hardly enough to build a case on. But combined with everything else, Dennis's constant presence, his obsession with preserving Lena's room, his resistance to any further investigation, it painted a picture that Clara couldn't unsee once she'd glimpsed it. "What do you want me to do?" she asked finally. "Just keep your eyes open? Look for anything unusual at the house? Any areas that might have been sealed off? Any spaces that don't match the exterior dimensions? And if you can, try to get your mother to consider allowing a more thorough examination of Lena's room." Clara agreed, but with deep reservations. If Reeves was right, if Dennis Larkin was indeed hiding something, then alerting him to their suspicions could be dangerous. But doing nothing meant accepting that her sister's killer might have been sitting at their dinner table for years, pretending to grieve while secretly relishing his successful deception. When Clara returned to Ridgeview for her mother's birthday the following weekend, she looked at the house with new eyes, measuring distances, comparing interior and exterior walls, searching for inconsistencies she'd never noticed before. The layout seemed straightforward. No obvious hidden spaces, no strange cold spots or hollow-sounding walls. But she did notice something odd about Lena's bedroom. The closet, when measured from inside, seemed shallower than it should be, based on the exterior wall's position. The discrepancy was slight, perhaps only a foot, but it was there. While her mother was napping, Clara examined the closet more carefully, running her hands along the back wall, looking for seams or hidden panels. The wallpaper was old, faded in places, but showed no signs of tampering. If there was a secret entrance, it wasn't immediately obvious. She was about to give up when she heard the front door open downstairs, followed by familiar footsteps. Dennis Larkin, arriving as he did every Saturday with groceries and companionship for Maggie. Clara quickly rearranged Lena's clothes to hide any evidence of her search and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Throughout the weekend, she found herself watching Dennis more closely, noticing details she'd previously overlooked. The way his eyes sometimes lingered on Lena's closed door when he thought no one was looking. The slight tension in his shoulders whenever Clara mentioned Seattle and her life there, as if her independence, her escape from Ridgeview, somehow threatened him. Most disturbing was his reaction when she casually mentioned having met with Detective Reeves. "Reeves?" Dennis repeated, his expression carefully neutral. "The new guy? What did he want?" "Just a follow-up," Clara said vaguely. "Standard procedure, I guess. Reviewing cold cases." Dennis's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, I hope he's not giving you false hope. After all this time, it's unlikely anything new will turn up." The certainty in his voice sent a chill through Clara. Not, "I hope they find answers," but, "It's unlikely anything will turn up." As if he knew, as if he was confident that whatever secrets existed were safely hidden. Before leaving Ridgeview, Clara met with Reeves again, sharing her observations about the closet dimensions and Dennis's reaction. "It's not much," she admitted, "but something doesn't feel right. Reeves nodded thoughtfully. I'll try to get a warrant to inspect Larkin's property, the basement specifically. If there was ever a connection between the houses, that's where we'd find evidence of it. And if you do find something, then we reopen the case officially, and we find out what really happened to your sister. But getting a warrant proved more difficult than anticipated. Without concrete evidence of a crime, just suspicions and architectural inconsistencies, no judge would authorize a search of Larkin's home. The investigation stalled once again, trapped in the limbo of suspicion without proof. Meanwhile, development at Lot 23 continued. The foundation was poured, framing went up, and what had once been an empty lot began to take shape as a small apartment complex. Dennis Larkin's construction company flourished, expanding to take on larger projects throughout Oregon. His reputation as a skilled builder was matched only by his standing as a community pillar. Generous with charitable donations, active in local politics, always ready to help a neighbor in need. Only Clara and Detective Reeves continued to question the carefully constructed facade. And without evidence, their doubts remained private, unproven, increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of years passing without new developments. Until 2017, when everything changed. 21 years, 8 months, and 12 days after Lena Whitmore disappeared from her bedroom, a construction crew arrived at Lot 23 Apartments for what should have been routine renovations. The building, completed in 1997, was being updated with modern amenities, new kitchens, expanded bathrooms, energy-efficient windows. The crew foreman, Eli Ramirez, had been in construction for 15 years, working his way up from laborer to supervisor. He'd seen plenty of surprises hidden behind walls and under floors, everything from forgotten cash to mummified pets. But what his team discovered that October morning went beyond unusual, straight into nightmarish. They had been removing flooring in Unit 104, a ground floor apartment that had suffered water damage from a burst pipe. The concrete subfloor needed to be broken up and replaced, a messy, labor-intensive job that required jackhammers and considerable patience. As they worked through the bedroom area, one of the workers noticed something odd about a section near the east wall. The concrete there was slightly different in color and texture, newer perhaps, or mixed differently than the surrounding material. "Hey, Eli," he called. "Come look at this." Ramirez examined the anomaly, noting that it formed a roughly rectangular section about 3 feet by 4 feet. "Patch job," he concluded. "Let's break it up and see what's underneath." Probably some plumbing they had to fix. But when the jackhammers broke through, they found no pipes, no utility access. Instead, embedded in the concrete like a fossil in stone, was a silver charm bracelet, tarnished by time, but unmistakably deliberate in its placement. The concrete had been poured around it, preserving it like an insect in amber. Ramirez, who had lived in Ridgeview all his life, recognized the significance immediately. The bracelet wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It matched the description of the one Lena Whitmore had been wearing when she vanished 2 decades earlier. Work stopped. Police were called. Within hours, the apartment was cordoned off, and forensics teams had begun the painstaking process of documenting and recovering the bracelet and examining the surrounding area for additional evidence. Detective Michael Reeves, now head of the Ridgeview Police Department's Small Detective Division, arrived within minutes of the call. He watched in grim satisfaction as technicians carefully extracted the bracelet from its concrete prison. "Bag it separately," he instructed, "and I want the concrete fragments analyzed, composition, age, anything that might tell us when this was poured." The news spread through Ridgeview with the speed of wildfire. By evening, a crowd had gathered outside Lot 23, held back by police tape and officers struggling to maintain the integrity of what had suddenly become a crime scene. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical flowers seeking light. Clara Whitmore, now 40 years old, and a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in trauma, was in session with a client when her phone began vibrating insistently in her desk drawer. When she finally checked it during a break, she found 17 missed calls, most from her mother, several from Detective Reeves, and one from a number she hadn't seen in years, Ross Hale, the original detective who had never stopped believing that Dennis Larkin was responsible for Lena's disappearance. She called Reeves first. "We found her bracelet," he said without preamble, "at lot 23 under concrete that was poured around the time she disappeared." Clara's heart seemed to stop, then restart with painful intensity. "You're sure it's hers? Silver chain, 5 charms including a tiny house. Your mother's on her way to identify it now, but there's something else you should know." Reeves paused, his voice dropping lower. Lot 23 was Dennis Larkin's project. His company poured that concrete, and according to the building records, he personally supervised the foundation work. The implications crashed over Clara like a wave, drowning the last shreds of doubt she'd clung to. Dennis Larkin, the man who had comforted her mother for 21 years, who had maintained Lena's shrine-like bedroom, who had inserted himself so completely into their lives, had hidden evidence beneath a building he constructed, evidence that connected him directly to Lena's disappearance. "Have you arrested him?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Not yet. We need more than the bracelet. We're getting warrants for his home, his business records, everything. I need you to come back to Ridgeview. Your mother's going to need support, and—" Reeves hesitated, then continued. "And we may need your help accessing your house. The closet dimensions you mentioned years ago? I think you were on to something." Clara canceled her remaining appointments and was on the road within an hour, driving south toward a confrontation she'd both dreaded and anticipated for 21 years. The 3-hour journey gave her time to process the tangle of emotions: vindication that her suspicions had been right, horror at what the bracelet's discovery might mean, and a deep, aching sadness that Lena's fate had been hidden in concrete all this time, just waiting to be uncovered. When she arrived in Ridgeview, the town was unrecognizable from the quiet community she'd left behind. Media trucks clogged Main Street. Crowds gathered in knots, talking in hushed, excited voices. Police vehicles, more than she'd known Ridgeview possessed, were parked at strategic intersections, directing traffic away from Lot 23 and, she noticed, from Dennis Larkin's house. She drove directly to her childhood home, where she found her mother sitting rigidly at the kitchen table, surrounded by police officers and a victim's advocate from the county prosecutor's office. Maggie Whitmore looked simultaneously ancient and childlike, her silver hair disheveled, her face pale and drawn, her hands clutching a tissue that had been shredded by anxious fingers. "Clara," she whispered when her daughter entered. "They found her bracelet. Her bracelet. Clara." Clara knelt beside her mother's chair, taking the older woman's trembling hands in her own. "I know, Mom. I'm so sorry." It was him. It was Dennis. All this time. Maggie's voice broke, decades of trust collapsing into betrayal too vast to comprehend. "He was here yesterday, sitting right there, drinking coffee, telling me about his new project, and he knew. He knew all along." Clara looked up at the detective standing nearby. Not Reeves, but a younger officer she didn't recognize. "Has he been arrested?" The detective shook his head. "We can't locate him. He wasn't at his home or his office. We've put out an APB, but so far nothing." Dennis Larkin, the cornerstone of their post-tragedy lives, the man who had practically lived in their house for 21 years, had vanished. Like Lena, he had simply disappeared, leaving questions in his wake. But unlike Lena, Dennis had resources, a successful business, connections throughout the state, money, the means to disappear if he chose to. Detective Reeves arrived an hour later, his expression grim but determined. "We have the warrants," he told Clara, "for both his property and yours. We're going to find out if there's a connection between the houses, just like Hale suspected." The search began immediately. Teams of officers and forensic specialists examining both houses simultaneously, looking for the hidden passage that might explain how Lena had vanished without a trace, without a sound, without Storm's warning bark. In Lena's bedroom, which had remained unchanged for 21 years, officers carefully removed everything: the bed, the dresser, the faded posters on the walls. They pulled up the carpet, revealing the original hardwood floors beneath. They tapped walls, looking for hollow spaces. They measured dimensions, comparing them to the building's exterior. And in the closet, that slightly too shallow closet that Clara had noticed years before, they found it. A seam in the back wall, cleverly disguised by the wallpaper pattern, but visible when the hanging clothes were removed and proper lighting installed. When pressed in the right spot, a section of the wall pivoted inward, revealing a narrow passage that led directly to Dennis Larkin's basement. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for an adult to navigate, and clearly hadn't been used in years. Cobwebs filled the space, and the air was stale, undisturbed. But it existed. The connection that Ross Hale had suspected, that Clara had sensed, that had allowed Dennis Larkin to enter Lena's bedroom undetected and remove her without waking the household or triggering the dog's protective instincts. In Larkin's house, the search revealed more horrors. A hidden room within his basement, accessible only through a false wall disguised as a storage shelf. Inside, a space roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, meticulously soundproofed and equipped with items too disturbing to describe in detail: restraints, tools, cameras. The room had been unused for some time, but luminol testing showed extensive blood evidence on the concrete floor, the walls, even the ceiling. Most damning of all was a metal lockbox found bolted to the floor in this hidden room. Inside were trophies, small items taken from victims: a hair ribbon, a single earring, a girl's diary with a broken lock, and photographs, dozens of them, documenting acts of unimaginable cruelty. Among these was a silver charm, a ballerina in mid-pirouette, identical to one that had been on Lena's bracelet but was missing from the bracelet found at Lot 23. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. Dennis Larkin wasn't just a murderer, he was a serial predator who had been operating in Ridgeview and surrounding communities for decades. The oldest items in the lockbox dated to the late 1980s, suggesting his crimes had begun long before Lena's abduction. And yet, he had hidden in plain sight the helpful neighbor, the community pillar, the friend who never left when times were hardest. The manhunt for Dennis Larkin became one of the largest in Oregon history. His photograph appeared on national news broadcasts, on highway billboards, in post offices and police stations across the country. His assets were frozen, his properties were seized. His carefully constructed life was dismantled piece by piece as investigators uncovered the full extent of his deception. It took 17 days to find him. Larkin had fled to a remote cabin in the Cascade Mountains, a property purchased years earlier under a different name, one of many contingency plans he'd established for exactly this scenario. He had supplies, weapons, and the delusional belief that he could somehow escape justice after decades of monstrous acts. When the FBI tactical team surrounded the cabin, Larkin had a choice: surrender or resist. He chose resistance, firing at officers and initiating a standoff that lasted 14 hours before ending in his death, not at the hands of law enforcement, but by his own choice, a final act of control when all other options had disappeared. In the aftermath, the full story emerged through forensic evidence, financial records, and the meticulous documentation Larkin himself had maintained. Lena Whitmore had been his first victim in Ridgeview, chosen because of proximity, opportunity, and the challenge she represented. He had planned her abduction for months, creating the hidden passage, testing sedatives on Storm, learning the family's routines and vulnerabilities. After taking her through the passage to his basement room, he had kept her alive for several days, a fact that brought renewed anguish to Clara and Maggie when they learned it. Eventually, he had killed her and transported her remains to Lot 23, where the foundation was being poured for his new development. He had encased her bracelet in concrete as a trophy, a reminder hidden in plain sight of his perfect crime. The search for Lena's remains continued for weeks, with ground-penetrating radar and other advanced techniques used to examine the entire foundation of the Lot 23 complex. Eventually, in a different section from where the bracelet had been found, forensic anthropologists discovered human remains embedded in the concrete, bone fragments and tissue that DNA analysis confirmed belonged to Lena Whitmore. There were others, too, at least 6 additional victims identified through DNA matching with missing persons, cases dating back to 1988. Dennis Larkin hadn't just been a murderer, he had been a monster hiding behind a facade of community respectability, using his construction business not just as a cover, but as a means of disposing of evidence. For Clara and Maggie Whitmore, the revelations brought a complex mix of emotions. Closure, yes, but also renewed grief, rage at decades of deception, and the horrifying knowledge that the person they had trusted most had been responsible for their deepest pain. "He sat at our table," Maggie said during a rare interview months after Larkin's death. "He held my hand at the memorials. He pretended to search for her when he knew. He knew all along where she was." Her voice broke, decades of misplaced trust crumbling into dust. "And I thanked him. All those years I thanked him for being there." Clara, drawing on her professional training as a psychologist, began speaking publicly about predatory behavior and the masks that dangerous individuals wear to gain trust. "The scariest monster," she told audiences, "isn't the stranger in the shadows. It's the neighbor bringing casseroles, the friend offering support, the person you'd never suspect because they've made themselves indispensable to your life." Detective Ross Hale, Arts Detectivionsenzaling, long retired from active duty, but vindicated by the resolution of the case he'd never stopped believing in, summarized it most succinctly when interviewed for a documentary about the case. "Dennis Larkin didn't just kill Lena Whitmore," he said, his weathered face solemn beneath silver hair. "He performed the ultimate magic trick. He made her vanish, then stepped into the spotlight as the concerned neighbor, redirecting everyone's attention while the truth lay hidden beneath our feet. For 21 years, he wasn't just hiding a body. He was hiding in plain sight, watching us search in all the wrong places." In the aftermath of Dennis Larkin's exposure and death, criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement experts studied the case extensively, identifying patterns that had been overlooked, warning signs that, in retrospect, painted a clear picture of predatory behavior hidden behind a mask of helpfulness and community spirit. These signs weren't unique to the Whitmore case. They appear repeatedly in similar crimes across decades and geographic boundaries, forming a template that might help identify dangerous individuals before tragedy strikes. Dennis Larkin made himself indispensable to the Whitmore family after Lena's disappearance. His constant presence, bringing food, handling repairs, organizing memorial events, appeared to be compassionate support from a caring neighbor. In reality, it was calculated behavior designed to maintain control over the investigation's epicenter. "Predators often insert themselves into the aftermath of their own crimes," explained Dr. Helen Morales, a forensic psychologist who reviewed the case. "They gain access to information, influence narratives, and position themselves as above suspicion. More importantly, they can monitor the investigation in real time, adjusting their behavior as needed." Larkin's pattern of involvement wasn't just extensive, it was exclusive. He discouraged other neighbors from overwhelming the Whitmores. He intercepted phone calls, screened visitors, and gradually isolated Maggie in particular, becoming her primary connection to the outside world. This type of behavior, what experts call manipulative caregiving, allows predators to control their victims' environments long after the initial crime. By positioning himself as Maggie's emotional support, Larkin ensured she wouldn't look too closely at inconsistencies in his story or question his continued presence in her life. For 21 years, Lena's bedroom remained exactly as it had been the day she disappeared, a shrine frozen in time. While parents of missing children often preserve spaces this way out of hope or grief, Dennis Larkin's insistence on maintaining the room unchanged went beyond normal support. When Maggie considered converting the space years after the disappearance, Warnedi Morkina Sedans Zerings, Larkin reacted with disproportionate opposition, framing any change as giving up hope and emotionally manipulating her into leaving everything untouched. The real reason, as investigators later discovered, was far more sinister. Changing the room might have led to the discovery of the hidden passage in the closet, the physical evidence connecting Larkin directly to Lena's abduction. He wasn't preserving memory, Detective Reeves noted in his final report. He was preserving crime scene evidence that would have incriminated him. By encouraging Maggie's grief-based preservation of the room, he ensured his own secret remained hidden. This pattern appears in other cases as well. Perpetrators who manipulate victims' families into behaviors that, intentionally or not, obstruct investigation or preserve the perpetrator's secrets. On the night Lena disappeared, Dennis Larkin claimed to have been home alone, asleep. With no witnesses to confirm or deny his statement, investigators initially had no reason to doubt him. But a later review of electrical usage records showed an anomaly. Between 12:15 a.m. and 2:30 a.m., Larkin's household power consumption spiked significantly, consistent with lights, appliances, and potentially power tools being used. When questioned about this discrepancy years later during the reinvestigation, Larkin claimed he'd been fixing a breaker issue in his basement. The explanation seemed reasonable at the time. What investigators didn't know then was that these were precisely the hours during which Lena had been taken through the hidden passage, murdered in Larkin's soundproofed basement room, and prepared for later transport to the Lot 23 construction site. Time gaps and alibis are critical red flags, explained former FBI profiler Cameron Wells, particularly when they align perfectly with the window of opportunity for a crime. Larkin's missing 2 hours weren't just unaccounted for, they were actively disguised with a plausible explanation that discouraged further questioning. Lot 23 represented more than just a successful business venture for Dennis Larkin. It was both disposal site and trophy case. By concealing evidence within the foundation of a building he constructed, Larkin created a monument to his crimes that he could visit, maintain, and control for decades. The timing wasn't coincidental. Ground was broken at Lot 23 just 3 days after Lena's disappearance, and the foundation, specifically the sections where her bracelet and remains were later found, was poured within 2 weeks. Construction sites provide perfect cover for evidence disposal, noted forensic anthropologist Dr. Maya Rodriguez, who led the recovery effort at Lot 23. Concrete foundations in particular offer permanent concealment that's unlikely to be disturbed. For someone in Larkin's position, with control over construction scheduling and access, it was an ideal solution. What made this aspect of the case particularly disturbing was Larkin's involvement in annual memorial events for Lena, events often held in a park directly across from the Lot 23 apartments. He had placed her family literally feet away from her remains during ceremonies ostensibly designed to honor her memory. The psychological satisfaction for perpetrators like Larkin is multi-layered, Dr. Morales explained. They enjoy the risk, the proximity to their crimes, and the power they feel watching others search fruitlessly while they alone know the truth. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Whitmore case was how easily Ridgeview accepted Dennis Larkin's excessive involvement with the grieving family. His behavior, which in retrospect clearly crossed boundaries of normal neighborly support, raised few eyebrows in a community that had assigned him the role of helper, protector, and pillar of strength. Several people later admitted having felt uncomfortable with Larkin's level of involvement, but had dismissed their instincts as uncharitable or judgmental. A handyman who had worked at both the Whitmore and Larkin homes reported seeing strange modifications to Larkin's basement walls, but never connected these to anything sinister. A neighbor had observed Larkin carrying heavy bags to his truck in the early morning hours after Lena's disappearance, but didn't report this, assuming it was related to his construction business. Communities often develop collective blind spots, sociologist Dr. Rebecca Freeman noted in her analysis of the case. When someone establishes themselves as above suspicion through charity work, community involvement, or support during crisis, people unconsciously filter out information that contradicts this positive image. This phenomenon, which Dr. Freeman termed community-enabled concealment, appears repeatedly in cases where perpetrators operate for years within close-knit groups without detection. The stronger the positive reputation, the more effectively it shields questionable behavior from scrutiny. In Ridgeview, Dennis Larkin had built his protective reputation carefully, becoming indispensable not just to the Whitmore family, but to the town's self-image as a caring community responding to tragedy. To question his motives would have been to question the narrative that had helped Ridgeview process its collective trauma, a narrative in which neighbors support each other unconditionally without ulterior motives or hidden agendas. The resolution of Lena Whitmore's case, coming 21 years after her disappearance, forced Ridgeview to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, perception, and the masks people wear. The town that had prided itself on safety and community closeness had harbored a predator for decades, never recognizing the danger hiding behind familiar smiles and helpful gestures. For Clara Whitmore, the discovery brought a complex mixture of vindication and renewed grief. Her suspicions about Dennis Larkin, dismissed for years as paranoia or misplaced anger, had been tragically accurate. The neighbor who had sat at their table, who had comforted her mother, who had maintained Lena's shrine-like bedroom, had been the monster responsible for her sister's death all along. The hardest part wasn't learning that Dennis killed Lena, Clara explained during a presentation to law enforcement officers 2 years after the case closed. The hardest part was accepting that we had welcomed him into our lives afterward, that he watched us grieve, watched us search, watched us hope, all while knowing exactly what had happened to her. That level of deception, that capacity for cruelty, it changes how you view humanity. Clara channeled her experiences into advocacy work, establishing the Lena Whitmore Foundation for Missing Children and becoming a sought-after consultant for law enforcement agencies dealing with cold cases and suspected predatory behavior. Her background in psychology, combined with her personal connection to the case, provided unique insights into how perpetrators hide in plain sight. Maggie Whitmore, already fragile from decades of uncertainty, struggled to process the revelations about Dennis Larkin's true nature. After his death and the recovery of Lena's remains, she declined most interview requests, preferring to grieve privately. She did, however, make one significant decision. She finally altered Lena's bedroom, removing the bed and other furniture and transforming it into a small memorial space with photographs, artwork, and natural light streaming through windows that remained permanently secured. "The room isn't frozen anymore," Clara noted. "It's peaceful now, a place for remembering, not for preserving secrets." For Detective Michael Reeves, the resolution of the Whitmore case represented both professional vindication and personal redemption. He had inherited Ross Hale's suspicions about Dennis Larkin, maintained them through years of skepticism from colleagues, and finally proven them correct through patient, methodical investigation. Cold cases aren't truly cold, Reeves told a journalist documenting the investigation. They're just waiting for the right moment, the right technology, or the right perspective. Lena waited 21 years for justice, but in the end, the truth couldn't stay buried, literally or figuratively. The broader impact on Ridgeview was profound. The community that had defined itself partly through Lena's disappearance now had to redefine itself in light of Dennis Larkin's exposure. The annual memorial events continued, but with a different focus, centered now on awareness, prevention, and the importance of questioning comfortable narratives. Local schools implemented expanded programs on recognizing predatory behavior. The police department established new protocols for handling missing persons cases, including mandatory reviews of any individual who inserts themselves prominently into investigations. Even the Architectural Review Board changed its requirements, mandating more thorough documentation of all structural modifications to existing buildings, a direct response to the hidden passage that had facilitated Lena's abduction. Perhaps most significantly, Ridgeview began to recognize and discuss the psychological blindness that had allowed a predator to operate in their midst for so long. Community forums addressed the tendency to trust those who conform to expected roles: the helpful neighbor, the community volunteer, the compassionate friend, while overlooking behavioral red flags that don't fit the accepted narrative. We wanted so badly to believe in the goodness of people that we created a blind spot, Mayor Rebecca Chen acknowledged during the dedication of a memorial garden for all of Larkin's victims. We assumed evil would announce itself, that it would look different, act different, be recognizable. But that's not how predators work. They blend in. They gain trust. They become the last person you'd suspect. This recognition, that danger often wears a familiar face, became Ridgeview's most important lesson from the Whitmore case. It transformed not just how the town approached community safety, but how its residents understood the nature of trust itself. For Ross Hale, the retired detective who had first suspected Dennis Larkin decades earlier, the case's resolution brought mixed emotions. His instincts had been proven correct, but at the cost of confirming that Lena Whitmore had died while the investigation focused elsewhere, while evidence went uncollected, while a predator manipulated the process from within. "I knew it was him," Hale told Clara when they met after Larkin's death. "I just couldn't prove it." "Not then. If I'd been able to convince your mother to let us examine that room more thoroughly, if we'd found that passage sooner—" "You can't do that to yourself," Clara interrupted gently. "Dennis fooled everyone. He built his whole life around making people trust him, around being above suspicion. You saw through it when no one else did." The legacy of the Whitmore case extended far beyond Ridgeview, becoming a case study taught in criminal justice programs and psychology courses nationwide. The friendly neighbor pattern, a predator who inserts themselves into the aftermath of their own crime, was recognized as a significant red flag in subsequent investigations. Forensic techniques developed during the examination of Lot 23's foundation led to breakthroughs in other cold cases where remains or evidence might be encased in building materials. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit incorporated lessons from Dennis Larkin's methods into their training materials, particularly his use of community standing as camouflage for predatory behavior. But perhaps the most profound impact came from the increased awareness among ordinary people, the recognition that safety isn't always found in the familiar, that trust must be tempered with awareness, and that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are those who work hardest to appear harmless. As Clara Whitmore often reminded audiences during her presentations, evil doesn't always knock on your door. Sometimes it's the one holding it open for you. The case of Lena Whitmore represents more than just a tragic disappearance and delayed justice. It reveals fundamental truths about human perception, community dynamics, and the masks that predators wear to move undetected among us. When a girl vanished from her bedroom in Ridgeview, Oregon, the community looked outward for answers, to strangers, to distant threats, to the unknown. What they failed to see was the danger standing beside them at the search parties, comforting the grieving mother, organizing the memorial events. The threat wasn't hiding in shadows but in plain sight, illuminated by porch lights and community trust. Dennis Larkin's successful deception for 21 years wasn't just a failure of investigation, though there were certainly missed opportunities and overlooked clues. It was a failure of imagination. No one wanted to believe that someone familiar could be capable of such monstrous acts. No one wanted to question the motives of a person who seemed dedicated to supporting a grieving family. No one wanted to disturb the comforting narrative of community solidarity in the face of unexplained tragedy. This collective blindness, this unwillingness to see what doesn't fit our preferred understanding of reality, represents the true danger exposed by the Whitmore case. It's not just that predators exist in our communities, it's that we provide them cover by refusing to recognize them when they don't match our expectations of what danger looks like. The warning signs were there. The excessive involvement that went beyond normal support. The resistance to any changes that might expose hidden evidence. The unaccounted time periods that aligned perfectly with the crime. The convenient disposal site connected to the perpetrator's business. The community's reluctance to question behavior that, in retrospect, crossed clear boundaries. None of these signs, individually, proved Dennis Larkin's guilt. But together, they formed a pattern that might have been recognized sooner if people had been willing to question their assumptions about who represents a threat and who deserves unexamined trust. The lesson of Lena Whitmore's case isn't that we should suspect everyone around us or live in constant fear of hidden predators. Rather, it's that safety comes not from blind trust, but from balanced awareness, from recognizing that danger doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes the most carefully constructed facades hide the darkest intentions, and that our instincts about something being not quite right deserve attention rather than dismissal. When Clara Whitmore sensed something off about Dennis Larkin's continued presence in their lives, she wasn't being paranoid. She was picking up on subtle inconsistencies in his behavior, on motivations that didn't align with his stated intentions. When Detective Ross Hale questioned why a neighbor would insert himself so completely into an investigation, he wasn't being cynical. He was recognizing a pattern common to predators who seek to control narratives around their own crimes. 21 years passed before these instincts were validated, before concrete cracked to reveal the truth that had been hidden beneath foundations both literal and metaphorical. 21 years during which a killer lived not just free but celebrated, trusted, respected, viewed as a pillar of the very community he had traumatized. The true horror of the Whitmore case lies not just in what happened to Lena, but in how easily her murderer maintained his masquerade afterward, how effectively he used community expectations and social norms as shields against suspicion. By becoming the person everyone wanted him to be, the supportive neighbor, the tireless volunteer, the shoulder to cry on, he made questioning his motives seem almost offensive, an attack on the values the community held dear. This is how predators survive and thrive, not by hiding completely, but by hiding behind personas so carefully crafted that challenging them feels like challenging goodness itself. The silver bracelet found beneath Lot 23's concrete floor wasn't just evidence of a murder. It was a symbol of how deeply truth can be buried when we prefer comfortable fiction to uncomfortable reality. It took 21 years, a construction accident, and the persistence of those who refused to stop questioning to bring that truth to light. In the wake of Dennis Larkin's exposure and death, Ridgeview, and by extension all communities confronted with similar revelations, faced a reckoning not just with a specific predator, but with the conditions that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. True safety doesn't come from denying darkness, but from acknowledging its potential presence even in seemingly safe spaces. It comes from balancing trust with awareness, from recognizing that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are those who work hardest to appear harmless. Lena Whitmore went to bed on June 17, 1996, and was never seen alive again. Her story reminds us that some threats don't break windows or kick down doors. They remove screens carefully. They create hidden passages. They build relationships based on false pretenses. They understand that the perfect disguise isn't invisibility, but trustworthiness. As Clara Whitmore continues to remind audiences through her advocacy work, if my sister's case teaches us anything, it's that evil often hides in the least expected places, behind the warmth of a smile, the stability of daily life, or the polite nod of a neighbor across the fence. The monsters aren't just in the woods or down dark alleys. Sometimes they're pouring your coffee, fixing your leaky faucet, or organizing the search party to find the very person they've taken. The question now isn't just how many other Dennis Larkins might be hiding in communities across the country, but how many warning signs we ignore, because acknowledging them would force us to question our fundamental assumptions about safety, trust, and the people we allow into our lives. Every disappearance has a story. Every silence holds secrets. And sometimes the truth isn't buried deep in the woods or hidden by time, but has been watched over, in silence, by those who claim to miss the victim the most. If you've ever ignored a feeling that something wasn't right, share your experience in the comments. And if you believe every hidden truth deserves light, subscribe, because we have more stories that reveal what the world often overlooks.